We're live.
Hello, this is Johnny,
This is Ismail.
and this is also Two Guys, One Book.
Welcome back.
Izzy, remember to mute your mic because I've got massive echo. Okay, we're getting back from a small hiatus here, so we're also going to work out some technical difficulties, but that's okay. We are still going to go unedited and unfiltered and unrestricted and all the sort.
Today is chapter 6 of, again, Ray Dalio's Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order. Talking about the big cycle of external order and disorder. So definitely some interesting talking points here regarding kind of international conflicts and trends and activities that lead to those events. And definitely a lot of touch points with what's going on in today's world, with China and Ukraine and Russia and the whole shebang. So definitely let's dig right in.
You never forget about North Korea. They are a big player on the world stage. They're constantly, showing off their military prowess by launching missiles into the ocean.
Yeah, North Korea is definitely an interesting one. Luckily, they haven't started any conflicts in a while, but they might, they might do something soon. You don't know.
And so, just I guess as a, an update, a recap. Here we are. We're in the same room. We're in Izzy's new apartment. Beautiful place, America. Land of the free. And so last time I think we talked about the internal order and disorder. So now this time is external order disorder, but they are highly related. So maybe we should jump into the 5 types of external conflict, or maybe conflict in general, honestly. And then you'll kind of see how internal order and disorder is related to external order and disorder. So Izzy, you want to start us off with conflict type number 1?
Oh yeah. So number 1 is going to be trade and economic wars. So again, all of these, just a precursor, they all kind of interrelate with one another. They all have touch points. One can lead to another. But the first is trade economic wars, specifically as it relates to tariffs and damaging essentially a country economically via trade or the absence of it. Some examples, I guess, we can touch on right now, today's world. We got I would say probably Russia would be a big one, enforcing trade, higher tariffs, not purchasing Russian oil. That is essentially just a method to force them into a corner economically and essentially penalizing them for a military conflict by restrictions on trade, which don't allow them to grow economically. So decrease in GDP, so on and so forth. So that's the first one. I guess I'll cover like the first few, and then you kind of cover the last ones. We can kind of talk about touch points.
Yeah.
But so that's one. We see that also historically. I mean, you look at World War II, Japan's growing war machine. The United States wasn't in favor of it. I forget what percentage, a high percentage at that time, pre-war, of Japan's oil came directly from the United States. And of course, as we know, oil and rubber and these sorts of things are essential for a typical war effort. Obviously, this is ignoring nukes and that sort of like supreme weapon. But typical standard warfare, you need rubber, you need oil. It's been a trend of 20th century warfare for quite some time. So when the United States banned that oil, set up embargoes on Japan, obviously they suffered, and that led them to pursue a more ground forces approach to dominating the area and gaining those resources via conflict. Secondly, we are moving on to technology wars. So specifically as it relates to restricting technology to whatever country is in the opposing camp. So I guess, a big example that we could see now would be semiconductors, right? So Taiwan is the leading producer of semiconductors, at least when it comes to the manufacturing of said semiconductors. The technology, based on my research, has been, for the most part, US centered when it comes to the technology behind them. However, the manufacturing is pretty much a monopoly when it comes to Taiwan producing all of it. So by the United States kind of having this partnership with Taiwan, or Chinese Taipei, whatever you want to call it, it kind of forces China into a corner, because China is not able to produce these by themselves, and most of the world relies on Taiwan to produce them. So by the United States becoming a little bit more, having a more strenuous relationship with China, kind of forcing them to pay premiums on these semiconductors on a territory that they claim that they own, just leads to a little bit more of a dicey geopolitical kind of situation there, because China in their mind thinks, hey, this is our territory, we should be gaining the profits from this. This is our territory, and the United States is like, oh well, it's kind of independent. We're one of the few countries in the UN who thinks that Taiwan is independent. So it kind of leads to some problems there. And we also have another point with Apple moving processor tech to the US, kind of, again, forcing China in a corner in a way, technologically. And it does kind of play into security, because, I mean, when it comes to semiconductors, those are present in virtually every piece of high tech that we have today. So by having China produce these things, it leads to kind of a question of, how are they producing them? What tech are they using to produce these? What is the level of security that we can feel as Americans in terms of manufacturing our own tech?
And one quick thing to add on to this is, like, kind of these types of conflict are interrelated, but they can also act independently, but often they are interrelated. Like, as you explained, the sanctions and stuff like that are often come, like, in a severe extent after military war starts, but this Apple moving, their processor manufacturing to the US, that's kind of like almost a preemptive defense measure to protect Apple's economic interests. And, since Apple is a United States company, it kind of protects the United States economic interests. It makes more people want to use the US dollar. And, if Apple likes US dollars, you know what I mean? So just a quick point there.
Yeah, no, 100%. And yeah, I mean, some of these are definitely, like you said, standalone. But I would say more times than not, I mean, one leads to another. You start off with sort of sanctions, trade war. Look at the Ukraine thing. Started off as a sanctions thing. Well, actually, first, before we talk about Ukraine, let me talk about number 3, because this is kind of going to lead into it. So geopolitical wars. Geopolitical wars are not boots on the ground. So quick clarification point, not boots in the ground. Geopolitical wars are essentially conflicts over spheres of influence, is kind of what I gathered. So alliances, and how that relates to how much influence a power of the regional power has, plays into a geopolitical war. So with the Ukraine piece, it started off as a geopolitical war. Talks about Ukraine joining NATO after historically, obviously, it's not a Western European nation, never has been, always has been under Russia's sphere of influence. There have been agreements made regarding NATO's acknowledgement that they would not impose any sort of membership on any of those countries, just post-Soviet Union, just to protect kind of Russia's sphere of influence and their kind of sovereignty in the region and their power. But obviously those agreements were violated, and it led to geopolitical conflict. Russia is saying, oh, you know what? Well, now this is outright, NATO, the West is trying to gradually increase, not violently, but they're trying to through agreements and membership in NATO kind of gradually infringe upon our area. And that's obviously led to boots on the ground, and it led to trade and economic wars. And further, another example would be even like you look at Yemen and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia wants to have their sphere of influence, and obviously there's a big butting of heads between the two big circles in that area. At least when it comes to the Islamic nations, so Israel excluded. I would say it's Iran and Saudi Arabia are the two big powers in that area, and there's religious tension there as well. But just the fact that Iran was under the cover trying to change a government that is directly adjacent to Saudi Arabia, so right on that Arabian Peninsula, for them to try to make those changes, Saudi Arabia took that as a geopolitical conflict, because you're trying to amass, basically change the whole structure of this border country's government, which threatens Saudi Arabia's security and their sovereignty as the power on the Arabian Peninsula. So just another example there. But again, that's led to kind of proxy warfare and bombing and these sorts of campaigns. But in essence, it started off as geopolitical.
I would definitely agree with that. And I mean, geopolitical war or conflict, I guess it isn't war. War comes with a lot of strings attached, maybe that word, but it does, like Izzy said, look like kind of alliances and stuff like that. So NATO and BRICS, the allies, the Axis, these are all like geopolitical kind of entities, and they're not in and of themselves like necessarily going to go out and perform a military campaign. Like NATO is the, what is it, North Atlantic Trade Organization. Like that doesn't sound like a military agreement, but there's a whole lot of clauses in the NATO treaty that does say, like, what is it, Article 5, if a NATO member's attacked, then all the other NATO members have to support it to some sort of extent. Another good example of this, I think, is the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the Iran nuclear deal. A lot of Western nations, especially Israel, are concerned with Iran, becoming a nuclear power, and they have been for a while. So this is kind of one of the examples of, the U.S., Israel, a lot of Western allies kind of coming to Iran and saying, "Hey, we're concerned with, you going nuclear. There's a lot of tensions in various spheres, like the religious sphere, especially that, uh, nuclear power may not be great for the Middle East. So we're gonna provide you some things that you want, billions of dollars and stuff like this, in exchange for you, slowing down development on nuclear technology." And so geopolitical conflict is as simple as, honestly, the pros and cons, kind of the give and take of like treaties in general, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm completely in agreement. And I would say also another big piece of that, Iran. I mean, because people have been worrying about Iran going nuclear for quite some time. It's been an issue since since Ayatollah Khomeini took over in like the 70s, right? We've always thought that, hey, they have nuclear capability, and do we really know at this point? No, but I mean, likely not. But that being said, another big, I mean, obviously Israel's afraid because they are closer to Iran than some of these other countries are. But Saudi Arabia is also a big part, and they're worried about that as well, because I would argue that even at this point in time, 2023, I would argue that Saudi Arabia is a bigger threat to Iran than Israel is, and not militarily. I'm talking about just like your sphere of influence, like we were talking about. I think Saudi Arabia has a stronger presence in the region, and in terms of allies, partners in that region, Israel has always kind of been the black sheep of that region, just because of, I mean, religiously, and also just culturally, it's just a very different place. So they have allies. I mean, they're friends with Saudi Arabia. Their relationship has been getting better and better and better over the years. So they've been really good. But Saudi Arabia historically has allies everywhere in that area. And Iran doesn't. And they're trying to increase their presence there. So I would argue that right now, the biggest geopolitical conflict, if the nukes was the main thing, the biggest people, the first target, I think, would be Saudi Arabia. That's what I would think. I think Israel's obviously like a number two. They're up there. But I think Saudi Arabia might be a bigger geopolitical threat, at least at this point.
Yeah, I think there's definitely some merit to that. Saudi Arabia, we just did some research before. Is the royal family alone is worth like well over 21 trillion, I think it was. So yeah, they definitely have a lot of influence in a lot of ways, and that 21 trillion is only the royal family. You can imagine how many businessmen who are in oil driving their golden Lamborghinis down the street, how much influence they have and access to black market weapons and stuff like that. Like I guarantee a lot of those guys can just recruit an army of their own and go overthrow a weak nation, a small nation. So I definitely hear you there. So our next type of conflict, the capital war, and coming out of page 194, these are conflicts imposed through financial tools such as sanctions, e.g., cutting off money and credit by punishing institutions and governments that offer it, and limiting foreign access to capital markets. And I think the best example of this right now, or in the recent past, would be the U.S. removing Russia from the SWIFT international payment system. If you're unfamiliar with that, the SWIFT payment system is kind of how most like banks, I think probably all international banks that use US dollars, like how all these countries have central banks and stuff like that save US dollars to trade with the US, and formerly trade with Saudi Arabia with the petrodollar setup, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But Russia being removed from that meant that all of their dollar reserves, whether that's just in a digital bank account, if it's in a digital bank account, they really can't access their money. But even with cash, it's like still there's some question as to whether they can trade with that, because they don't have the probably the accounting software that goes with the Swift system and stuff like that. Like, I'm sure it's like a whole suite of tools. What else? So
Honestly, with that, I have a quick point with the Swift thing. When I was thinking about it, and I just looked it up too, but I would imagine that because Swift, the entire purpose is to create a centralized way of currency conversion and trade. And by doing so, there are set conversion rates that you cannot pursue any sort of arbitrage opportunities there, because it's set and it's a centralized thing. So if you're going from euro to pound to USD to ruble, you're getting there's a set rate that obviously fluctuates, but I mean, there's no way to beat the market there. You can't get more rubles than you had dollars originally. But now that the ruble is not on there, I imagine, and we were talking earlier offline about how India is buying a lot of Russian oil. And I would imagine that there are, I don't know about how significant, but there must be arbitrage opportunities now, because now that they're not centralized when it comes to currency conversion, you could probably get either trading to ruble or trading from, I would imagine trading to ruble. You would end up actually making profit by buying in ruble, because they're not on Swift anymore. So I would imagine that some foreign investors might be, and India is probably pursuing this through the oil by purchasing in their rupee or whatever. It's probably worth more in rubles than it originally was. So they might actually be getting a better deal and actually getting huge discounts on oil. And I think that might be something that a lot of these non-allied countries that are just kind of like in the middle here, they're going to start taking advantage of that and being like, you know what, now that they're not centralized, we can really take advantage of that and actually make more profit by doing so. And same thing with foreign investors, kind of buying a bunch of, Russian mark commodities that might be a really good investment opportunity. But again, I'm no investment consultant, so don't just start buying rubles, because I don't know how that would go for you.
Yeah, and even more to that, I wrote down here in the outline, which we'll link again. Not sure if anyone reads it, but we'll link it again. The U.S. sanctioning Russia, they've also sanctioned Iran, as far as I'm aware, out of the SWIFT system. Was they kind of failed to hold up their full end of the JCPOA deal, the nuclear deal, and it made Iran run to the arms of, or it made Russia run to the arms of Iran to kind of figure out, okay, how did y'all get around all this? Like, how did y'all trade with people? How do y'all trade with people today? And um, you know, it kind of, I don't know. I feel like there's a big West East kind of alliance going on right now, some tension there, and it kind of made Russia run even further into the arms of the East. Iran, and we have the BRICS coalition. They have Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. We know India's purchases of Russian oil are increasing since before the war, relative to before the war. That's partially due to cheaper oil, as Izzy brought to my attention, but I think it is also because they're creating like geopolitical alliances right now. They're creating deals like Russia with Iran is like, hey, we need some more support right now. So can y'all send us over some drones? And Russia's, sending over those Iranian drones into Ukraine. So it's kind of, this is just another example of how like capital wars between like two nations can lead to geopolitical alliances, geopolitical conflicts potentially between a greater number of just like interrelated nations. And ultimately, I think those can kind of combine to, lead to what we think of as military war, like deployment of ground forces that involve actual shooting and tanks and planes and F-16s, and potentially nukes nowadays. uh you know these capital wars, these geopolitical wars really combine to create the ultimate kind of the crown on top of what we think war as. And of
Yeah.
course today we see Russia coming into Ukraine pretty hot, not backing down, and we see NATO, another geopolitical alliance here, another capital trade technology alliance here, uh, coming together to send over a bunch of money, a bunch of armaments. I'm not sure if they're sending over manpower, but I do know a lot of people from the West have signed up to the Ukrainian military to go and fight in the trenches. I've seen the live streams on YouTube. All these guys go with their GoPros, and they're like, I don't know. It's a very interesting dynamic there.
Yeah, 100%. And I would also, just to add on to that, I think was talking about the SWIFT and talking about like the BRICS alliances, kind of the growth of geopolitical alliances in the East. I would say that I think China has been a very big middleman for these people, because I mean, think about historically in the West. I mean, the center of Western financial markets, I mean, at least for the past century or so, has been, in the United States. I mean, we are the people, receiving currency and exchanging currency. The USD is kind of that middle currency that you exchange to and from. But now that, with Iran and Russia out of SWIFT, they can't turn to that. So now they're like, hey, who's going to accept our currency? Well, China's going to accept your currency, So they found a big banking partner and market partner in China, to basically enable them to continue doing business with countries that don't have outright, sanctions on them, to allow for them to actually continue to utilize their currency, So China, as a Eastern financial capital, I would say, has started to come more and more, to kind of the forefront of just financial markets in general. They're starting to just get a bigger share in everything. They're taking all these countries that have been kind of, screwed over, I guess, in ways by exchange rates with USD, and they're saying, hey, come over here to this camp. We can, we'll be able to exchange with you, give you a fair price. We got a yuan, which is a relatively strong currency. Yeah, so it's quite interesting how they've kind of not only developed as a industrial center, but also as a financial, market center, which is just really interesting, because it kind of shows how that country is maturing as a first world power.
I'm totally on the same page there, and now may even be a good time to talk about BRICS. How they're planning to roll out a new gold-backed digital currency. This kind of goes along the lines of China aspiring to be the new primary financial center of the world, because clearly, based on the US's success over the past since I guess the 1920s, 1970s or whatever. I believe it was the 20s when the U.S. really became the global reserve currency, maybe after World War One. But are really kind of since then, and primarily since the 70s, the U.S. dollar has become the U.S.'s main export. I really like when people say that. I think it's super true, because it's rather than going and digging up our oil or whatever, the U.S. just flips on the printing press, and now all of a sudden they have a bunch of valuable stuff to export, and you know, it makes it tough for countries, especially nowadays, to want to lend to the U.S. if they know that they're just going to we're just going to turn on the printing press and pay them back with just a bunch of paper money. Obviously it comes down to, I think, the population kind of agreeing on, what has value. If the majority of the world believes the US dollar, if that paper still has value, then it will retain its value. So it's not a guarantee that, printing a bunch of money will lead to the downfall of the US dollar, or the BRICS gold backed digital currency will lead to the downfall of the US dollar. But the fact is, I mean, I know I personally have a lot less confidence in the US dollar, knowing that, just over COVID, we printed like more money, or created more digital money at least, in like just like 2 years than we ever had before. And I'm sure other countries look at that and kind of feel a similar way. So it might be nice for a lot of countries, and for me personally, to see a currency backed by assets, backed by gold, and like oil and stuff like that, that you know can't really be printed into oblivion very easily, especially if it uses the technology to be able to track exactly, like, okay, how much gold is this country taking in, how much of a certain asset is this country taking in, versus how much money is being created. The technology we have today, the blockchain, really allows everyone to be able to like track those things, and it could certainly lead to a currency that has a lot more faith in it, a lot more like agreed upon value by a lot of the world, that would lead to a lack of faith in the US dollar, a lack of faith in the paper money, especially considering BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, is home to 41% of the global population. And we know many, many countries want to join. We know Argentina, Iran, Turkey, and I'm those are just the ones I remember off the top of my head. All want to join. As a result, they've all been buying unprecedented amounts of gold, producing and kind of hoarding unprecedented amounts of assets like energy and food and manufacturing supplies and stuff like that. And it really does. We see this meeting coming up in August that really represents maybe a new phase to this like geopolitical slash technology, since now we're moving into digital currency slash trade and capital economic war that, I mean, could put the US in a tough spot and could make us want to engage in a military war.
Yeah, and one thing just to note would be as it comes to the inflation and kind of trust in the US dollar, I will say that one thing we got to keep in mind here is it is cyclical, right? Like, financial systems and inflation rates are not, it's not a, I'm trying to find the word for it. It's not, there's not a standard pattern to these things. It depends on a lot of factors. And I will say that I'm pretty positive. I'm looking at it now, but it seems like the highest period of inflation was during kind of that 1979, 1980 recession. That was the worst. And I'm seeing here the year 1980, the inflation rate, or 1979, the inflation rate in the United States was at 13.3%.
One, I want to let you finish, but one small caveat is I assume that's based on the consumer price index, the standard, inflation measure, and that has changed over time. The U.S. does have incentive to change that to make the inflation numbers seem better than they are. I don't know to what extent it has changed, but that is something to also keep in mind.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, CPI definitely has changed, but this is based on the Consumer Price Index database, all urban consumers, U.S. cities average all items. So we're looking at a basket of all items and averaging all cities. So obviously this may not be the most accurate. I'm sure there's other, as you said, like other factors included here, but it claims that 2023, our estimated inflation after 2022 is 6.5. 2023 is expected to be 2.7. I don't know how accurate that is. Obviously, we don't know. It's a forecast. But ultimately, the main takeaway here is not that, it's better or worse now than it was back then. It's kind of apples and oranges. We have different consumption needs. We have different, like, there's just so many other things that affect this number. However, takeaway is it is cyclical, and I'm sure, and I heard firsthand from my grandmother and my grandfather that people were really worried about the US dollar collapsing in 1980. They were really worried about it, and rightfully so. I mean, 12.5, 13.3% inflation is insane. That's not good. However, then Reagan did his tax cut, which ended the recession, essentially. Or at least maybe not wasn't the one thing that ended the recession, but it contributed to ending the recession. So there's a lot of policy involved with this as well. It's not simply a one-to-one of how much are we spending. Is the Fed printing money that's going to lead to inflation? Yes, it does. However, it is cyclical. And I would imagine, my forecast is I think that this next election period, we will have a Republican president. That much I am pretty all but certain about. If Biden is reelected, I think we said this on the last one, but the election was fixed for sure, for sure. And I think that we will have a Republican president, and what that will lead to is tax cuts and probably forcing a recession period, because that's, again, part of the cycle of GDP and part of the cycle of the Fed is you need to, when you're at these periods of high inflation, you need to force the recession so that those level out. And then when people are spending more, then you can kind of raise that rate. So then you're kind of more, you're pumping more money into the market. So, do I think it's the end of the US dollar? It very well could be. But just one thing I just wanted to keep in mind here, that we it is a cycle, and there is kind of there's a lot of factors involved here, and inflation rate and currency strength relative to the rest of the currencies in the world is not the only two factors, right? Like, there's so much more involved here. I mean, that's why they don't pay me to be an economist, but that's why they get paid the big bucks, I guess, is to research these cycles and trends. But all we can do really is forecast, and yeah, I think that soon enough we should have dropped our inflation rates a little bit, assuming Janet Yellen is not the head of the Fed anymore. That would be nice. Get her out of there. She sucks.
Yeah, this brick stuff really a lot of it does come down to psychology. That is the tough part. Like, in the 1980s, clearly the psychology of the United States population, the global population, I'm sure also kind of had some doubts in the US dollar. Like, it did turn around. It although historically, like when you talk about the global reserve currency, eventually it seems that there comes a day where psychology does not turn around. It like builds up, and I think this, if it's not even guaranteed that in August they're going to announce this gold backed currency. However, if they do, that could lead to Ray Dalio had some words here on page 197. The greatest risk of military war is when both parties have military powers that are roughly comparable and irreconcilable and existential differences. As far as I see it, the West and the East have roughly comparable military power. The West may have a little bit more conventional military strength and technology sphere. The East likely has the population in terms of like military age, fighting age, men with, I don't know, the right psychology, not infected anything that would make their minds soft, like the LGBT stuff. But certainly at least to a sane leader of the United States, which I'm not entirely sure we have many of those, but the death of the US dollar as the global reserve currency, considering the dollar is our main export, and has enabled us to amass this massive amount of debt, which is, of course, like that's borrowed money, right? That's credit. Like, our global reserve currency offers us credit to borrow a lot of money. And if there's a threat to that credit, that's truly, to me, seems like an irreconcilable and existential difference, because as of now, this we'll quote again from our little book summary we went through. This long cycle of peace and prosperity, fueled by our excess spending and our accumulation of debt. Like, that's how we fund everything. We're just like, we're going to everyone's door, knocking on the door and saying, "Hey, you want to give us some money? Give us some money." And it plants the seeds of terrible and violent wars. And when the military powers are comparable, we know both sides have nukes. We know both sides have like strong AI. That's probably going to be more powerful than a nuke one day, according to some experts. It is concerning that we could lead to some sort of global conflict, and especially considering with how like connected everything is. We know that we have this global supply chain that's easily disrupted, and If there are disruptions in it, then there are incentives to go and undisrupt it. So if like there's a disruption in Europe, the US is going to go over there to help them out because many of our allies in Europe buy our stuff. They like our US dollars for now. If there's a disruption of the oil supply, that's fuel for war, fuel for our economy right now before we switch over to, renewable energy or whatever, if that ever happens. But for right now, like an oil supply disruption and stuff like that, it provides a lot of incentive for us to go and intervene, whether that's hopefully it's just geopolitically, through some sort of treaty or alliance or something like that. But odds are with, I want to reference this graph right here on page 196. I'll just show it on the screen on my video. Basically, there's this like clear pattern between what is it, in the recent past, every like 70 years, every 70 years or so, maybe 120 honestly, but every 70 to 100 years, I'll call it, there's massive death in Europe from various wars and stuff like that. And I don't know. Seems like we're overdue, if you're asking me. Like if you extrapolate this line right here, we're like about 100 years away from 1930, the midpoint between World War I and World War II. So just quantitatively, we're a little ways away from another world war
Well,
here.
I think we're in one now, right? So ultimately there is more death kind of going on here. Man, sorry for the interruption. Watching the cat stare down the dog. Yeah, Europe's always been kind of a ripe breeding ground for conflict. But that being said, it's just kind of interesting seeing how that comes into play. And one thing that's been a common trend throughout European history has always been spheres of influence, like always been the way, from Rome to Holy Roman Empire to the what are the in modern day Turkey, what were they, the Byzantium, and these kind of spheres of influence here has always been present. And ever since World War II, that dynamics changed because it became, again, a West versus East sort of thing. Talking about traditional powers like, England and France and these countries to now Russia. And one thing that we need to also understand is that on this graph, all of these wars are involving Western European nations. This one that we're currently going through is involving Western Europe, but not through death. Like, they're contributing economically, providing military aid, supplies, resources. But the death is not, they're not involved in that. That's purely almost I would even relate it more as a civil war than an actual war. Because Ukraine has always been, arm in arm with Russia since, the development of that Cyrillic culture. They've always kind of been really close, so kind of different, but the same, ethnically. And so it's interesting to see kind of like how and if Western Europe will be kind of like you said a little while ago about being directly involved, boots on the ground, because that would change. I think that would not end well for the continent of Europe, honestly. And I think people are kind of understanding that and being like, let's keep this to a regional conflict and not involve external forces. But ultimately, this war was imminent and it was bound to happen. Given and I'm not pro-Russia. I wouldn't say I'm pro-Russia, but I will say that there were violations, kind of like we talked about when we're talking about geopolitical conflict. Like, there were violations of treaties that were outwardly. I don't know if the listeners know this, but Ukraine used to have nukes. They did. They had a lot of nukes. Why? Because it was Soviet Union and they needed to have nukes in that region. So they had a lot of nukes over there. What happened was when Ukraine became a separate country, Russia was like, I don't know if we want you guys to have nukes. So we're going to make this agreement that we're not going to invade this country. We're going to recognize your sovereignty in exchange for your retirement of these nuclear missiles. So you don't have that external threat. And then I think after that came the agreement between them and NATO of saying, hey, listen, Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. It's dissolved. However, we need to have an economic sphere of influence in this region still. This is how we create money. This is how we operate. We trade primarily because any country primarily trades with their neighbors. Always how it's been, always how it will be. So they made that agreement, and then now NATO's like, oh, we they got Finland, and they're looking at Sweden now, and they were talking with Ukraine, and it's like it's very interesting because in my mind, I'm no conspiracy theorist, but I believe that this was NATO's recognition that like you said, we need a war. We need a war. And they did this, I think, fully well knowing that Russia would not stand by that violation and that this would instigate some sort of action from the United States. Now, that action has not been as much support as maybe Zelensky may have wanted, but it got them what they needed, So in my mind, I think this is all kind of a big covert play into kind of like we did in World War One, kind of just we're supplying, and then it becomes, oh no, they attacked our vessel. Oh no, like the Lusitania. Oh, they sunk our merchant ship. Oh gosh, we have to go to war now. So I think it's going to be one of those slow transitions, but it's all the intention is to generate revenue by going to war. The war machine's been asleep for quite some time. We're talking about it offline. Like we need they're itching to create some money. These people have been on standby for a long time. And it's irrefutable that war is a driver of economic growth. It is, especially if you're the one with the upper hand in the war. Then you're getting a lot from it. So
one thing I want to add on to this, maybe to reason like, oh, why did the West feel like there needed to be a war? Like, I think for a long time there's been perceived weakness in the US dollar as the US has seemingly exponentially acquired debt and printed money and stuff like that. And if you think about it, like the winner of this West versus East conflict that's seemingly taking shape will probably have the most economic strength, and it could be some sort of outlet for the West to maintain this kind of US dollar hegemony that they currently have. Kind of makes sense. And it's also very interesting how this is kind of unrelated, but it's interesting how the West seems to be like putting out this propaganda that are like, pick a side in this war and support it. Like, that's why it's so controversial to say, oh, I'm pro Russia. And versus like, I'm pro Ukraine. Like the whole media right now seems to be like, if you don't support Ukraine, then you're a bad person. And
you're a fascist. You're a fascist, evil, conservative, neo-Nazi. Like it's so ridiculous. And I don't want to interrupt you, but I just find it so interesting that the liberal, progressive group of people, being a liberal, the definition of that has changed crazily over the past, I would say, even 5 years. Like progressives are, standard, typically progressive liberal people are anti-war, kind of like post flower child, kind of like, even anti-vax. They were always the ones. I remember growing up, my parents were super liberal when I was a kid, and it was like, vaccinations were a thing, that they were like, why are we giving him these shots, all natural food and no war and all this stuff. And now it's like, because this narrative has been determined, you gotta check every check mark or you're the opposition. So they've kind of sneakily put in this thing as like solidarity for Ukraine has turned into, are you in support of the war machine? Which is just so contrary to, traditional liberal values of nonviolence, which is just, I find that so interesting that these people are like, oh, just, obviously I'm not happy that Ukrainian people are getting killed and, bombed and all this stuff. Obviously not. This is something that, it's horrible and a tragedy no matter how, who are the parties involved. When civilians are dying, it's never good, right? But ultimately, it's like, it's just crazy how people have just fallen into that narrative. Like, hey, you know what? Yeah, I'm in support of Ukraine, but also I'm in support of war against Russia. Yeah, it's baffling to me, but yeah, it's the transition of finding one main narrative. And again, if you don't find that check mark, you can be all the other things: pro LGBTQ, pro freedom. You want to be whatever, be able to say whatever you want. You love these little echo chambers you have. You like the narrative to be pushed, but then if you say, I think I have critical values over Ukraine, Russia, then all of a sudden they're like, oh, you're not a liberal. Right, you're a fascist. You don't belong in this camp. Although you support all the other stuff, if you don't check one check mark, you're opposing. So,
And I think part of this is, again, going to long cycles of peace and prosperity often plant the seeds of terrible, violent wars. Like, and I think it's fair to say the longer and more peaceful and prosperous the peacetime is, the more terrible and violent the war is. There's more money, there's more weapons because you have more money. There's more infrastructure, more people to fight a war. And it's also like, just people forget that like war actually is really terrible and violent. And I feel like a lot of times even people forget that they're gonna die. But you've if there's more than like a generation, between the last really bad war, like, our last really bad one was like World War II or maybe Vietnam. But still, like, the youngest person, the I guess people our age, what are we, Gen X, right? We're after the millennials. Uh, the youngest person that we know is like our grandfather, or that were in Nam, and then our great grandfather, maybe our great grandparents that were, or great great grandparents that were in World War II, and we forget that, oh, my uh grandfather has like 10 types of really bad cancer because he was exposed to Agent Orange in Vietnam. And you got to remember that we were the ones putting down the Agent Orange. They just got secondhand exposure, and you can only imagine how bad the Vietnamese folks who have lived there for generations are suffering. I've seen the pictures online, like horrible birth defects to this day. Like people with like 3 eyes and like 15 fingers, they don't even have like fully formed skulls. Like, it is bad out there. And that is like generations after war, right? And so we forget how bad things get. And now today we have even more powerful weapons, even more deadly, like weapons that'll just like torture you to death. And we seemingly don't care because we love Ukraine, right? That above all else, Ukraine, you know.
yeah, and I want to add one thing just about the Ukraine. And the more I think about it, I'm like, okay, so if we want to classify an Axis power contra to the Western established allies, I would say definitely, kind of as we mentioned, Ukraine, Iran, Russia, China, right? North Korea probably could put in there, but North Korea is pretty. It's almost like a. At least for right now, they seem like kind of a chihuahua. They make a lot of noise, but They don't actually do anything. However, in my mind, I think if you were the West and you were in charge of this whole military hegemony of powers, you would say, okay, what we should do is we should isolate and weaken individually. Together, it's a very strong force. But by isolating and using these different conflicts that we kind of talked about, weaken them separately. And I think that this whole play in Ukraine was all, they knew that China was not going to get involved with this. So they said, you know what? This is our chance to expose Russia's weakness, to expose this sort of not only weakness militarily, but also corruption within their own government and the power of external groups and their influence on the government. Like we saw with the whole Wagner group, like the Wagner group and their whole taking over, like, their whole situation that happened there. And I, in my mind, I'm like, that's a really smart way of exposing Russia for being weak and almost like isolating and knocking down one at a time, and that way, now our biggest threat is definitely China. And we can't do that easily to China. However, by kind of taking Russia out of the economic picture, out of the banking picture, and clearly militarily, showing their ineffectiveness militarily, it almost proves that, okay, Russia, although they have nukes, they are not, which is it's big to have nukes, don't get me wrong, but they're not our biggest threat. They're not a big threat anymore. We've kind of neutralized them in so many different ways and kind of castrated them economically, castrated them politically, showed, how corrupt this system is, cut them off of SWIFT and financial markets. You're taking off so much from them that now this country by itself is really not a threat, right? So I just think that that's kind of the play here. I think that's kind of the playbook is let's weaken, separate and weaken pretty much, divide and conquer, I guess. And China, again, not as easy, but it makes sense, simulate the war machine, weaken a rival, and kind of gain confidence in the fact that of your own military and military, political, and economic superiority over somebody, and that's why Putin's so threatened, because he's like, his ego's like, well, Russia kind of sucks actually, and their propaganda machine is trying to make things look good, but it's not going so well,
Hey, and if we go to war, then I don't know, half our Western debts are canceled, it seems. I feel like the majority of that is to China. They've been buying a whole lot of bonds to honestly probably an expression of economic war. You control, you increase the debt service of the West, right? And you ultimately put them in a place where they can't spend as much money as they want to on military. They can't spend as much money on Social Security or improving their infrastructure, or improving, their domestic power in general. And that kind of goes into the next kind of section I wanted to talk about. Since we're talking about World War, we might as well figure out who's going to win, right? Forecast that. And the quote I want to bring up here is, military and domestic power go hand in hand. So the two points here I want to bring up is weakness and disorder in the US lead to a soft military, and then strength in China shows indicators of a strong military. And so what do you think about all that?
It's true and false, because people forget how large and omnipresent our military is. Our It's almost an irony of our system that, you would think that strong, like that assumption does hold true in most situations, I would say. You go to a country in, Southern Africa, you go to like Botswana or something, it has a very weak economy and it has a very weak, if even present, military, right? So it does track. However, what the factor that kind of leads to the, exemption from the rule is if you've already asserted military dominance historically. right? So the United States, I don't know how they would do in combat. They haven't been in combat in a while. But I will say that the amount of money, our economy and our military spending are virtually independent. We're going to pay, we're going to invest in our military regardless of what our economic situation is. So high inflation doesn't matter. Then we're just going to put more money in the military, you know? So I think, you know, in a way, it's almost an exception. And we have such a massive investment in military resources. I would say our weakness would probably be equipment. However, I mean, just from the Navy's presence, I mean, look at that by itself. They're operating virtually globally, you know? So there are fleets deployed in the Pacific. Um, I'm pretty sure there's an Indian Ocean fleet. You have, you know, Atlantic. They're everywhere, right? So it's like, you know, and subs are everywhere. I don't even know where the subs are. I think that to answer the question, I think that it holds true for most countries. China definitely has a very strong military. However, the United States has had a pedigree and a history of very strong military presence globally that would be very hard to overwrite. I think they've established dominance and through world wars and through regional conflicts like Vietnam and stuff, just kind of flexing that military muscle. And I think the United States has been very good at, you know, at the expense of civilians globally, but they've been really good at periodically finding opportunities to flex that muscle, you know, and to show kind of the sheer dominance. Like Iraq, like people were like, oh, it's gonna be so hard. You know, Iraq's got to the fourth at the time, like the third or fourth biggest military in the world, and we marched right in and took virtually no casualties, taking over Iraq. You know, were there weapons of mass destruction? No. Were, you know, hundreds of thousands of civilians killed? Yeah. But ultimately, we did what we intended to do, which is very Machiavellian, but essentially, those civilians don't matter. We showed our dominance. We showed that no matter how strong of a military they might have had in their home turf, we are still stronger, right? So, yeah, I don't know. I wonder what it would be right now if the U.S. were to be deployed right now, how that would go. But I would imagine that it would. I think we have a lot stronger of a military than people might think.
So I agree with you. Like in probably a short-term conflict, the U.S. would be pretty dominant, even if it was global. I think that's really our only chance at winning a world war if it does come about. Though I'm less certain that we would win, that the West would win if you know, it was a longer term conflict. If we I don't know. It like war, one thing about war is it is about the supply chain, right? Like a lot of strategy in war is about, you know, getting behind enemy lines and like blowing up railroads, you know, in the Russia-Ukraine war, and blowing up roads and bridges and stuff like that. So, you know, troops can't get supplies. And another part of that is actually, you know, when supplies break, when equipment breaks, and things of that nature, you got to have, uh, you know, people to fix it. You got to have the materials and the tools to fix it. And with how high tech our military is, and how many of our, you know, chips, our semiconductors and stuff like that just lie outside the US, like way behind enemy lines. It's a little bit concerning to me that, you know, once we're a year or two in, like, can we maintain that power, you know? And that even goes to, okay, can we maintain the manpower, you know, up front, since the US hasn't been in conflict for a while, like you just said. I think we would lose a lot of guys, you know, right up front. Um, you know, we would have to kind of refigure out, you know, our military strategy, since the world has changed a whole lot since we have been in, uh, you know, a major conflict. And, um, you know, like this kind of goes actually back to one thing the Ray Dalio talked about in the Revolutionary War. You know, the British came over just lining up in a line in the field, and the American revolutionaries were just shooting from the trees, and the British were, you know, complaining about that. And obviously, it seems ridiculous today. But I imagine that there are similar dynamics that would play out today, uh, in terms of like how we would deploy our forces and how they would be countered. That could play out, and in terms of, okay, if we do lose a lot of guys up front, or if it's just a long conflict and we lose a lot of guys along the way, do we have more to replace them? I think that is one thing that, is on my mind, because, as we've strayed away from traditional family values, less people in the US are having kids. More of those kids are really not in a psychological state to be in a war. Like they could barely go to school without killing themselves, it seems like. And it's, we I don't know. I guess in a longer term conflict, the US's dominance is a little less certain in my mind.
I agree, and ultimately, I mean, I think from a manpower perspective, I think we're good because the military has a very constant flow of people coming in. I mean, yeah, predominantly they're lower class people coming in from, high school recruiters and things of that nature. But I think from a manpower perspective, we're good. But I am reading this article right now from the Center for Strategic and International Studies that's saying in a major regional conflict, credit to Seth Jones for writing that article, but in a major regional conflict such as a war with China and the Taiwan Strait, the U.S. use of munitions would likely exceed the current stockpiles of the U.S. Department of Defense. According to the results of a series of CSIS war games, the United States would likely run out of some munitions, such as long-range precision-guided munitions. This would occur in less than 1 week in a Taiwan Strait conflict. So, 1 week. But that kind of goes with what you're saying. I think from a manpower, it would have to be a short war. We don't have, because we've been, and this is kind of because we've been giving so much stuff to Ukraine, that all these small arms munitions and, even the precision guided things. I mean, we gave them like anti-tank missiles and things of that nature. So we would need to invest really heavily in our stockpile. And, if people are already saying, I think one of the higher ups of the Air Force had said that, by 2027 or something like that, where we like China, might be making moves in that strait. So, it's really just a matter of how can we prepare. But it kind of going along with the whole Revolutionary War analogy, like the United States has historically struggled in guerrilla conflicts. Very much so. Had a very hard in traditional warfare, very good. But from a guerrilla warfare perspective, when you're fighting in someone else's area and they have kind of guerrilla tactics and they're kind of hit and run and going to different bases that you don't know the layout of the land, we struggle bad. Like Vietnam was a disaster. So I think that there are a lot of challenges that are present here, and I'm curious to see I'm curious to read into this detail of this war game and kind of what factors they included here, because I wonder what would turn the tides, because I know China has been investing very heavily in terms of their stockpile. So they had not just nuclear, but in terms of just kind of weapon stockpiles, defense systems and whatnot. So I'm curious to see how, what are the possible scenarios if this were to happen, which obviously hope it doesn't, but what how that would play out and what factors would lead to different, conclusion events.
Yeah. And I mean, one factor to keep in mind there is, since our stockpile is already running low and our manufacturing is outsourced, and our, population of, fighting age, men is, mentally unstable. You compare that to China, where, we have outsourced all of our manufacturing to them. So they have the manufacturing powerhouse, and you know how well that served us in World War II. that enabled us to continue on in that longer term conflict. And then you also have China, which implemented this one child policy. Demographically, Peter Zion would argue that that was a bad idea, like from an economic standpoint, but from a military standpoint, uh, that kind of led to, and this is just an objective fact, like a lot of the Chinese population right now is fighting aged males. And there is a lot of, kind of agrarian culture out in China. So these guys are already strong. They already know how to use their hands. They can use tools, whether it's for farming or, military conflict. And you combine that with, I don't know, the infrastructure they've created with the Belt and Road Initiative, their manufacturing power, and then their growing stockpile of weapons and, I would argue like strong alliances. Like they have a pretty strong alliance. China's obviously been kind of tough to deal with from a Western perspective. But as far as I know, in the East, like China, people are warming up to China. I know for a fact the Middle East is warming up to China because, excuse me, you know, Israel of all countries, Benjamin Netanyahu was threatening to go to China for like different types of support since the Biden administration moved in, and hasn't even invited him to visit DC. That's kind of unprecedented. They're really burning a valuable bridge there. And then Iran already wants in the BRICS. Saudi Arabia is thinking about moving to selling their oil in local currencies, including the yuan, destroying the petrodollar because of less U.S. military presence in the Middle East and greater military presence, I imagine, of Chinese and Russian troops. And so I don't know. There are obviously a lot of factors to this equation, but um, you know, so from like the economic standpoint where we stand right now, the US is clearly on top. We still have the global reserve currency, but that is even looking less certain in coming months, as we discussed with the BRICS digital currency and strong trade alliances developing with the excommunication of Russia and back in the day Iran from the SWIFT system. It's led to a lot of reliance on China. It's got a very large sphere of influence, even in its enemies. And I don't. This might be slightly off topic, but are you aware of the border issues going on, where supposedly a lot of military aged Chinese men are like kind of being flown or shipped to South America or Central America and kind of making their way up through Mexico with a lot of cash and stuff like that. I've heard a lot of different stories about that with the sources I listen to, and it and now we even see China making unprecedented military drills, like carrying those out in the Taiwan Strait, sending over planes and ships and stuff like that. And uh I was even listening to something else recently that was talking about, even in like the South China Sea near the Philippines, uh the the fishermen down in the Philippines almost feel unsafe because China's navy is starting to occupy more of that, and they're like running boats like over, like they're literally uh sinking boats by running into them because they're trying to be like, yeah, this is not your sea anymore. The US is not here to protect you. You better make some sort of geopolitical relationship with us, starting another geopolitical war with the West and the East, trying to get the Philippines on their side. But one thing I will say to the US's like a pro on the US's side strength there is our alliance with Japan. The Japanese are still a good military power, I think, at least they have the potential to be. I don't think they're kind of allowed to be, but they do have a strong relationship with the US. They do have like a lot of technology there. I believe, I don't know.
They design semiconductors, at least they used to. They design them, but it's like a weird supply chain because they help design, the United States helps design, but the manufacturing is obviously Taiwan. But about the whole fishing thing, so two things. So one, I looked up the Chinese. I see that they're a growing presence in Panama and other Central American countries, like they're moving and kind of like there. I'm not seeing
Cuba
anything
too.
about. Oh, yeah, I can. It just says Latin America. It doesn't say anything about migrant. It says here, yeah, it's not. I don't know how accurate this source is. I've never heard of this website before. But I mean, according to what it's really saying, it's just saying that they're kind of like coming into Latin America and establishing trade relationships, which that makes sense. But further with the Japan situation, I mean, Japan, yeah, they can't have a military, but they've been kind of reforming their constitution a little bit and realizing the threat. And obviously, the United States is open and willing to allowing for that because that takes a little bit of the burden off of them when it comes to defending the Japanese islands. But that situation with the Chinese Navy standoff against other countries has been going on. Like I think I showed you that video where they were like Japanese fishermen in like Okinawa and these southern islands are kind of like they're being like outwardly threatened by Chinese like Coast Guard patrol boats and stuff, which has been going on for a while. But what Japan has been doing is they've been building up their self-defense force and fortifying islands in their southern kind of chain. Because obviously you have like the main 4 islands, and then you just have like a chain of islands that kind of go out like this. And they've been fortifying those islands and establishing kind of like defense, like like bases on these islands, so that they can defend the island chain. And they're running military drills. I think that they're ready. Well, they're trying to be ready for any sort of Chinese excursion into those areas. But they're a critical resource because essentially we need the Philippines, we need Japan, and then we need Indochina. All of that is a buffer zone to China's naval capabilities, right? I think we talked about it before, but like all that land can buffer China in, or if they take that, then it opens it all up, right, to the rest of the Pacific. So I'm really curious to see. We've already established such a strong presence in that area, so it'd be really hard to kind of go back on that. But I think very similarly to the Ukraine thing, I think we've kind of put ourselves in that situation, right? Like it started putting U.S. Navy assets in that region, for decades, and for what, like ultimately, again, denying China their sphere of influence in a way, kind of just saying, oh, you know what, like ultimately you are not the arbitrator for this region. That's going to be our military, which leads to them being like, why do we have to go through the U.S.? We have all the capabilities shipping wise, and when it comes to our military, like we should not be getting monitored in our own waters. Right. So it's kind of like a weird conflict of interest there because obviously not I'm not a Chinese supporter, but ultimately it does kind of track. It's very similar to the Russia thing where it's like you're kind of bottling in this country that clearly has already set precedent that, hey, we are the global leader. I mean, not global, we are the regional leader here, so why is it only asks for conflict when you do that thing. It might have even, I would argue, it might have been better if we just either removed or just kept our naval assets to the Philippines and Japan and allowed for free, unrestricted trade from China, because that might make the entire region way more prosperous, right? But at the same time, the trade-off is that means that their sphere of influence is growing. So it's a weird thing that you got to really just kind of think about. But I don't know. Those are just my thoughts.
These are interesting thoughts, and I don't know. There's One quote by Ray Dalio in the summary: if you want to win wars, have power, respect power, and use power wisely. And the US right now, we certainly have power. Do we respect it? I don't know that we do. Do we use it wisely? I think that goes into a lot of respecting power and maybe using power strategically. If we like you just said, if we let China kind of trade freely, maybe that would have been a little bit more wise. Especially since I don't know, we were kind of sending mixed signals to them. We were like, let's enable China economically, maybe a little transition into a democracy. It didn't work out, and then we wanted to bottle them in. It's kind of sending mixed signals there. It probably gets China pretty irritated, I imagine. I don't think that the US would like any country coming over and just maybe putting their boats in Hawaii and saying, "Oh yeah, Pacific Ocean's closed. Sorry guys. You got the Atlantic, the Panama Canal, it's pretty much useless now." You know, I don't think we would like it. But man, and it almost seems like China is trying to do this. They're not putting their boats out in Hawaii, but they have now they have a military base in Cuba, 90 miles off the coast of Florida, right? That's just like monitoring communications and stuff like that. They are, as I said before, they have an economic alliance with Brazil and the BRICS coalition. Argentina wants to join. I've heard that Mexico wants to join. A lot of the Mexican population seems to be concerned about that. But as far as I see it, BRICS is kind of the equivalent to NATO, right? Starting out as a economic alliance, and now they're creeping over to South America, Central America, and all of a sudden we're in the same situation as Russia. We got nukes on our border from enemy forces, and just leading to a lot more potential for world war, or at least major regional conflicts in that arena. And it all kind of came down to, in my opinion, the U.S. not using our dollars wisely. That's our main export, and for the global reserve currency, if the real value of the economy increases, you have to have an increase in the monetary supply in order to not have like a deflationary dynamic. So, it's not like it's always wrong to print money, but I think we took it too far. Um, I really do, and I think it's coming back to bite us.
I agree. I mean, I just also think that China's doing what we did in like the Teddy Roosevelt era in the Latin America, where they're kind of going through and, what's the quote? Like, speak softly and carry a big stick. So they're kind of coming through with these very advantageous trade offers, and they're like, yeah, but also we're a pretty damn strong country too. So like, and that's something that we're not doing. We're speaking very softly, and we're not even showing the stick at all. So they're kind of doing what we did really early on to establish our current presence that we have internationally. That's kind of what they're doing as well. And either two things can happen from that realistically. Either China and the United States are continuously at odds, that would lead to an inevitable conflict somewhere. It's going to, if it continues to go the way it's going, because you're butting heads in contested regions that are spheres of influence. Or second would be that they would essentially kind of join forces in a sense of like, we're going to split authority and set almost like what we did in Europe with the East and West and having the Iron Curtain, and they have Soviets have this side and we have this side, and that's it. It would be that, but on a global scale. So where there's a aggression thing going on, but they have their area and we have ours. which would probably compromise the security and economic systems that a lot of these countries in the East that are allied with the US have had for, decades up until this point. Like countries like Japan and the Philippines and things like that. Like they're very concerned, rightfully so, about like, what's if the United States reasonably does not want to go to war with China, are they just going to allow for them to, kind of dictate our policies now? Are they our new are they the new, big guy on the block, you know, which, could lead to some issues down the road, but yeah, it's interesting to see China, especially with the Panama Canal. I didn't know about that. I know that China, there's always been a good amount of Chinese people in Panama, like for sure, and also Latin America. Even before this whole period, there have been Chinese presence in that region, also Indian as well. But curious to see like why they're going to Panama specifically, to kind of maybe make some business agreements there with the canal, or maybe getting rid of costs when it comes to trade through the canal. The canal is arguably the most important trade point in the Americas for sure. So if you have not necessarily, no one has control over the canal. The United States still has probably number one, dibs on the canal, but to eliminate the fees and the costs associated with using that could definitely come to China's benefit for sure. Expands their presence trade wise, gives them money, it can only end well for them. So
All I gotta say on that is, last time we saw a canal clogged, and I forget the name of the canal, but it was during COVID.
the Suez in Egypt. Suez Canal.
The Suez Canal, boat just got, like it just went across it, just like went into the edge of the canal, and then we saw, a global supply chain of like just break down completely. And if the Panama Canal is the most important in the Americas or in the West, then and China has a bunch of military age personnel over there. It's like, oh, well, we accidentally used one of the canal locks wrong, and now it's broken down for 6 months. And now how are we going to? How is the you know how is America going to effectively or quickly get its Atlantic Ocean fleet over to the Pacific Ocean to prevent China from taking over Taiwan, for example? It's like, it's kind of a sketchy situation. And yeah, I mean, very, very uncertain times that we live in right now. And really makes you wonder, why did God choose us to live in these times? But I think only time will tell on that one. But do you have any closing thoughts?
Not really. I just, it's interesting to see. I do want to, for the next episode, I want to do maybe a special episode, war game. I want to do some war games. I think war games would be fun. Being able to analyze like what our, capabilities are. I think that would be a pretty interesting episode, like a little bonus episode before next chapter. So keep in the loop, guys. I mean, next episode might be a little war gaming. May not end well. It might be a depressing episode, but we'll see.
Maybe we can watch that movie War Games. I've never actually seen it, and so it might be pretty interesting to do a little movie review slash mock war game here. But we will see. So with that, two guys, one book. Read the book. Maybe just read the outline. I don't know. Up to you. Maybe just listen to the podcast. But yeah, good talk today. Definitely, stock up on your guns, get your own little stockpiles up to date, learn from the US, prepare your home, get some food, and yeah, hunker down, prepare for war, because it's coming.
Uh, Yeah, hopefully not. But yeah, also be nice out there, folks. Be nice out there, folks. People are getting crazy out here, so don't keep calm and carry a big stick. Right? So, all right. Till next time.
Bye.